Among the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from the ancient city of Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions of 1888 through 1900, a particular group of Sumerian literary texts presented scholars with what remains one of the most compelling puzzles in ancient Near Eastern studies. These tablets, many now housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia, and the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, preserve detailed accounts of a divine being who systematically violated the foundational legal codes of Sumerian civilization. The being in question was Inanna, goddess of love and war, queen of heaven and earth, and arguably the most powerful and unpredictable figure in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. What makes this body of literature extraordinary is not the transgressions themselves, which are documented with remarkable narrative precision across independent textual traditions spanning more than 1,000 years of continuous copying and expansion. It is what follows them. The ancient scribes recorded in careful detail how Inanna stole the divine decrees of civilization from the god Enki, how she descended into the underworld and challenged its queen, how she returned from a realm from which no one was supposed to return, how she condemned an innocent spouse to death in her place, and how she unleashed violent destruction against entities that had done her no measurable harm. The accounts are rich, specific, and corroborated across multiple independent tablet families, but the legal consequence is missing. In a civilization that produced the world's first written law codes, that maintained detailed judicial records on clay tablets, that documented divine deliberations in council sessions at Nippur's Eka temple complex with the administrative precision of a modern government ministry, there is no surviving punishment decree for Inanna. There is no verdict tablet, no council judgment, no divine sentence commuted or carried out. 9 distinct violations of what Sumerian texts call the Me, the divine decrees governing cosmic and social order, remain without any recorded consequence. This investigation examines those 9 violations, the legal framework they occurred within, the divine council that should have adjudicated them, and the extraordinary possibility that the missing punishment was not lost to history, but was deliberately, systematically, and permanently removed from the record. If the evidence we're about to examine challenges what you believed you knew about the ancient world and the divine governance systems that shaped its earlier civilizations, consider following this investigation further. Among the most revealing absences in all of Sumerian literature is what scholars have come to call the punishment gap in Inanna's narrative archive. The goddess who stands at the center of more literary compositions than any other figure in ancient Mesopotamia's religious tradition is also the only divine being who accumulates a documented series of cosmic violations without facing recorded divine judgment. Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, who spent decades translating Nippur's cuneiform collection throughout the middle decades of the 20th century, identified no fewer than 9 distinct episodes in which Inanna violated what Sumerian texts designated as the Me, the foundational codes governing both celestial and earthly order. Each violation was preserved with narrative precision. The consequences were not. The scale of this absence, when measured against the detailed judicial records that Sumerian scribes produced for lesser divine infractions, constitutes a problem of historical interpretation that no conventional explanation of tablet loss or preservation accident can adequately resolve. To understand why this absence is so significant, it is necessary to establish what the Sumerian archival tradition actually preserved regarding divine punishment for other figures. The god Enlil's violation of the goddess Enlil is documented with extraordinary procedural detail across tablets from Nippur's Eka temple archive, including the formal divine assembly that deliberated the case, the specific charge rendered, the sentence of banishment to the underworld, and the subsequent legal procedure by which Enlil followed him, and negotiated the conditions of his partial restoration. The tablet designated as Ni 4136 in the University of Pennsylvania collection preserves this legal proceeding with the administrative precision of a court transcript. The divine scribe recorded the assembly's deliberation, the mechanism of consensus, and the binding determination that resulted. Similarly, the punishment of Apsu in the Babylonian tradition, derived from Sumerian antecedents, is documented in the creation epic with judicial specificity that identifies the violation, names the punishing authority, and specifies the consequence. King's binding and execution following the primordial conflict is recorded in terms that match the language of Sumerian administrative judicial records from Nippur's court archive. What emerges from systematic comparison of these preserved punishment records with the absence surrounding Inanna is not a picture of random tablet survival, but a pattern of selective documentation that requires explanation on its own terms. The Sumerian scribes who maintained Nippur's literary archive were not casual record keepers. They were professional specialists trained across decades in institutions whose primary function included the preservation of exactly this category of divine legal proceeding. The absence of any punishment record for Inanna across 9 distinct violations and across the entire surviving corpus of Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian literature from multiple sites, spanning more than 2,000 years of continuous textual tradition, is not an accident of clay preservation. It is a fact that demands systematic investigation. The University of Pennsylvania expeditions at Nippur recovered approximately 30,000 tablets and fragments, the largest single collection of Sumerian literary material from any site. This archive is not uniformly preserved. It contains gaps, fragmentary compositions, and texts known only from single copies. But for compositions that occupied stable positions in the active scribal curriculum, the archive preserves multiple copies that collectively confirm the composition's established form. The texts recording Inanna's violations are among the best attested compositions in the entire Nippur corpus. The descent of Inanna survives in no fewer than 8 significant fragments from Nippur alone, with additional copies known from Ur, Meturan, and Susa, demonstrating distribution across the full geographical range of Sumerian scribal culture. The Inanna and Enki text survives in multiple Nippur copies and shows evidence of having been a standard curricular composition across the entire Old Babylonian period of approximately 2000 to 1700 BC. If a punishment narrative for Inanna had existed and occupied a similar position in the scribal tradition, statistical probability alone would predict that at least fragments of it should appear somewhere in this 30,000 tablet archive. None do. William Halo of Yale University, in his foundational survey of Sumerian literary genres published in the journal Israel Exploration in 1983, catalogued the canonical compositions of the Nippur curriculum and noted the structural completeness of the tradition for most major divine narrative cycles. The cycle surrounding Inanna's violations is structurally anomalous in a way that Halo himself did not fully address. It contains detailed crime without consequence, evidence without verdict, transgression without the administrative resolution that the Sumerian institutional framework was specifically designed to produce and preserve. The implications of this anomaly extend beyond the literary into the organizational. If the punishment was not recorded because it was deliberately removed from the archive tradition, that removal required access to the archival network, the authority to suppress distribution, and a motivation powerful enough to sustain that suppression across more than 2 millennia of copying and transmission. Understanding what kind of punishment could have motivated that scale of suppression requires first understanding exactly what Inanna violated, and why those violations were of sufficient cosmic magnitude to demand formal divine response. Understanding what Inanna violated requires understanding what the me actually were in the Sumerian conceptual framework, because the answer is more technically specific than most modern analyses acknowledge. The me were not commandments in the sense of moral prohibitions, they were operational codes, the fundamental algorithms that made civilization function at every level, from personal behavior to cosmic order. Tablet Ni 4312 from the Nippur collection, now housed in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, preserves one of the most complete enumerations of these decrees ever recorded on clay. The list is staggering in its scope, cataloguing over 100 distinct me including kingship, the descent to and ascent from the underworld, the scribal arts, the craft of the smith, the legal principle of righteous judgment, the principle that violations of divine order carry defined consequences for their perpetrators, and dozens more domains that together constituted the total operational structure of Sumerian civilization. The critical distinction between the me as operational codes and the me as moral commandments becomes clear when examining how Sumerian texts describe their function in concrete terms. The me of kingship did not merely designate rulers as special. It actively generated and maintained the institutional conditions under which royal authority functioned. The crown, the throne, the royal scepter, the royal seal, and the behavioral protocols that allowed subjects to recognize and respond to kingly authority as legitimate. Without the me of kingship actively operating, the texts suggest, a king would not merely be an illegitimate ruler, but would cease to generate the recognizable social reality of kingship altogether. The me functioned, in modern systems terminology, as the underlying protocols without which the surface phenomena of civilization could not operate. Thorkild Jacobsen of Harvard University, in his 1976 study of Mesopotamian religious history, described the me as the divine laws that govern the universe, but this formulation understates their active operational character. A better analogy for contemporary readers might be the foundational code operating beneath visible applications. Not the visible interface, but the underlying logic that makes the interface possible. The significance of this distinction for understanding Inanna's first violation becomes immediately apparent. When Inanna acquired the me from Enki through the episode at the Abzu, she did not merely obtain titles or authority markers. She obtained the active operational mechanisms that produced those social realities, and when she transferred those mechanisms from Eridu, the oldest city and Enki's primary earthly seat, to Uruk, her own city, she did not merely relocate symbolic objects. She performed what the tablets themselves present as a fundamental restructuring of the operational architecture through which civilization functioned. The me that Tablet Ni 4312 enumerates include items that reveal their operational character through their specificity. Among those listed are the me of truth-speaking and the me of descent to the underworld, but also the me of the kindling of fire, the me of the extinguishing of fire, the me of the priestly office, the me of the diviner's craft, and the me of the prostitute. The inclusion of these apparently mundane or socially specific items alongside cosmological principles illuminates the Sumerian conceptual framework. For the scribes who composed and copied these texts, the operational codes governing temple prostitution, and the operational codes governing the movement of celestial bodies belong to the same category of foundational mechanism. They were not hierarchically ordered in the sense that one category was more fundamental than another. They were laterally organized as a complete set of codes that together generated the total structured reality within which both gods and humans existed. Removing any one of them from the system did not merely affect the domain it governed. It disrupted the interconnected network of all the others. This systemic interdependence explains why Enki's response to the theft of the ME was so dramatically urgent. He was not defending professional dignity or institutional authority. He was responding to a disruption of the operational system that produced the structured reality within which his own activities, including his authority and his ability to respond, were embedded. And it explains why the failure to pursue formal legal remedy for that disruption is so analytically perplexing. The most systemically important act of divine theft in Sumerian literature generated no recorded legal consequence whatsoever. The first violation in Inanna's documented record takes place at Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, at the temple complex known as the Abzu, the primary earthly residence of Enki, the god of wisdom, magic, and the subterranean freshwater ocean. The tablets from Nippur, catalogued as Ni 4521 through Ni 4529, collectively designated as the Inanna and Enki text by Gertrude Faber-Flug in her 1973 analysis of the composition, describe an event that unfolds over the course of a single divine feast. Inanna arrives at Eridu unannounced, is received hospitably by Enki, who offers beer, wine, and ceremonial bread, and over the course of the celebration, as Enki's judgment becomes progressively impaired, she receives each of the Mi as personal gifts bestowed with formal ceremonial language. When he awakens to discover the Mi already aboard Inanna's boat of heaven, and in transit toward her city of Uruk, he dispatches sea monsters, great waves, and divine messengers in increasingly desperate attempts to recover them. All fail. What no tablet records is the legal complaint that should have followed. The narrative structure of the Inanna and Enki text repays careful attention because its internal organization reveals a level of deliberation in Inanna's actions that transforms the episode from a mythological encounter into what the administrative texts from Nippur would classify as a premeditated act of institutional theft. Inanna does not arrive at Eridu by accident. The text describes her washing herself, anointing herself with sweet oil, putting on the royal garments, taking her seal in her hand, and travelling to the Abzu with specific intention. The preparatory actions are not described as those of a divine being making a casual social call. They match the protocol descriptions for formal divine visitation that appear in the administrative correspondence from Murray, where tablets from excavations conducted by André Parrot between 1933 and 1955 describe official divine embassies employing identical preparatory procedures. Inanna's preparation encodes premeditation. She knew what she intended to obtain before she arrived. When the Mi are transferred, the text records each item with ritual specificity, naming each Mi individually as Enki presents it with the formal phrase, "Here it is, take it." The repetition of this formula across the transfer of more than 100 distinct Mi is not literary decoration. It is the tablet equivalent of a notarized transfer document, establishing that each Mi was formally and individually bestowed with ceremonial language that constituted legally valid gift transfer in Sumerian institutional practice. Enki's subsequent attempts to recover the Mi through force, rather than through formal legal petition to the Divine Council, are themselves diagnostic. The God of Wisdom, the divine figure most consistently associated with knowledge of proper procedure and institutional law, chose to pursue recovery through practical rather than legal means. This choice suggests either that he recognized the legal validity of his own gift transfer and understood that a formal complaint would fail on its merits, or that some feature of Inanna's status or authority placed her outside the jurisdiction of the formal complaint mechanism that would normally apply. The text's description of the 7 successive failed recovery attempts is structured as a progressive demonstration of comprehensive failure across all available categories of Enki's power. He deploys sea creatures, they fail. He generates storms, they fail. He sends his divine messenger Izimud with increasing authority, each embassy fails. He deploys the 50 monstrous beings of the Abzu, they fail. The pattern of 7 failures mirrors the structure of the 7 gates in the Underworld narrative, and like the 7 gates, each failure reduces the available options until the exhaustion of all conventional responses forces confrontation with the reality that the situation cannot be resolved through normal means. What neither the Nippur tablets nor any other known source records is what happened when that reality became undeniable. There is no tablet describing Enki's acceptance of the permanent loss. There is no record of a formal resolution, a negotiated settlement, a divine council arbitration, or a subsequent restoration of any portion of the Mi to their original custodian. The episode concludes with the Mi arriving at Uruk amid celebration, with the goddess of Uruk receiving the operational architecture of civilization into her city, and with nothing further recorded about any legal or institutional consequence for what the tablets themselves present as the most consequential act of divine theft in Sumerian history. The narrative of Inanna cannot be properly analysed without first establishing the astronomical framework that undergirds her entire mythological identity. Because the Sumerian scribes who recorded her transgressions were simultaneously encoding precise celestial observations that required centuries of systematic data collection to generate. Inanna's identification with the planet Venus was not decorative symbolism. It was a statement of technical astronomical correspondence that embedded observational data about Venus's behaviour in both the morning and evening sky within the structure of divine mythology. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, designated as tablets 63 through 100 in the Omen series known as Enuma Anu Enlil, constitute one of the most important astronomical documents in the entire ancient Near Eastern corpus, preserving observations of Venus's appearances and disappearances over a 21-year period that demonstrate Babylonian understanding of the planet's synodic cycle of approximately 583.92 days, and the 8-year cycle after which Venus returns to near identical positions against the background stars. The astronomical precision encoded in Inanna's mythological identity extends far beyond the basic identification of the goddess with a visible planet. The specific narrative structure of her descent and return mirrors Venus's actual behaviour in the sky with accuracy that requires explanation. Venus disappears from its position as the evening star for a period of approximately 50 days as it passes on the far side of the sun, then reappears as the morning star, then disappears again for approximately 8 days as it passes between Earth and Sun at inferior conjunction, then reappears once more as the evening star to complete its cycle. The descent of Inanna describes exactly 3 days and 3 nights in the Underworld, a period that does not correspond to Venus's actual disappearance duration at inferior conjunction, but that does correspond to the traditional minimum observational threshold that Babylonian astronomers used to confirm a celestial body's absence from visibility, as documented in the astronomical correspondence tablets from Nineveh, catalogued in the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection. The 8-year Venus cycle encoded in Sumerian astronomical tradition corresponds to the 5 complete synodic periods of Venus that occur within 8 solar years, producing a pattern in which Venus traces a nearly perfect pentagram against the background stars when its successive inferior conjunction positions are plotted across the 8-year cycle. Babylonian mathematical tablets demonstrate awareness of this geometric pattern, and the pentagram's subsequent adoption as a symbol associated with Ishtar, the Akkadian successor to Inanna, in the Neo-Assyrian period reflects continued recognition of this astronomical relationship. Ernst Weidner of the University of Graz, in his 1914 examination of Babylonian astronomical texts, demonstrated that the Venus tablet series in Enuma Anu Enlil preserves observations that were originally collected during the Old Babylonian period, but were based on computational methods derived from Sumerian astronomical traditions that predate the surviving tablets by several centuries. The Sumerian scribes who first identified Inanna with Venus were not engaging in poetic fancy. They were recording an astronomical observation so precisely structured that it would enable their descendants to calculate Venus's position centuries forward from the observation baseline. The significance of this astronomical foundation for the violation narratives lies in what it reveals about the nature of the texts themselves. If Inanna's mythological narratives encode precise astronomical observations with demonstrated accuracy, then the violation episodes embedded within those narratives may similarly encode historical or institutional information with a precision that mythological reading has obscured. The descent of Inanna describes specific procedures, specific locations, specific sequences of events, and specific legal outcomes with a technical exactness that matches the precision of the astronomical encoding. When the text describes the 7 gates, the specific divine attributes removed at each gate, the precise conditions of the substitute requirement, and the exact mechanism of Inanna's revival and return, it is employing the same narrative precision that elsewhere encodes demonstrably accurate astronomical data. This parallel between the demonstrable accuracy of the astronomical encoding and the technical precision of the violation narratives provides a framework for approaching the latter as documentary record rather than as free mythological invention. It also raises the most fundamental question that this investigation will pursue across multiple lines of evidence. If the violations were recorded with documentary precision, and if the Sumerian archival tradition consistently preserved the consequences of divine violations with equal precision, what would motivate the systematic removal of precisely those consequence records from every version of a text that was copied across 2,000 years and distributed across the entire geographical range of Mesopotamian scribal culture? The second violation in Inanna's documented record is simultaneously the most dramatic and the most cosmically significant, because it involves the transgression of a boundary that was not merely a divine law in the legal sense, but a structural feature of the Sumerian universe itself. In the cosmological framework preserved across dozens of Nippur tablets and supplemented by Uruk literary compositions, the universe was divided into 3 distinct vertical realms: the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the Kur, the great below. The fundamental principle governing movement between these realms was directional, and the texts state it with striking consistency. Existence flows downward. Living beings may descend, dead beings cannot ascend. This principle was presented in the literary tradition not as a prohibition that could theoretically be broken, but as a structural impossibility embedded in the nature of reality itself, analogous to the way ancient Mesopotamians understood the flow of water from elevated ground to lower elevations, a condition of the cosmos rather than a rule imposed upon it. The three-realm cosmological framework and the directional principle governing movement between its levels appear in multiple, independent Nippur compositions in ways that confirm the structural rather than merely legal status of the prohibition. The Sumerian text known as the Death of Gilgamesh, reconstructed from fragments across 3 museums, including the British Museum, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and the Suleymaniye Museum, presents the directional prohibition not as a divine decree that could potentially be revoked by divine authority, but as a feature of the universe's architecture, equivalent to the separation of earth and sky at the primordial creation. The Nippur lamentation texts, including the lament for the destruction of, catalogued and analysed by Samuel Noah Kramer in his 1940 study, repeatedly invoke the underworld's finality as a cosmic constant that even the most powerful divine beings cannot override. The phrase "no one returns from the underworld" appears in 3 distinct Nippur compositions, in forms that employ grammatical constructions indicating structural impossibility rather than mere prohibition, the same grammatical forms used to express other conditions of cosmic architecture, such as the impossibility of fire being cold or water flowing upward. This grammatical precision is not incidental. The Sumerian scribal tradition maintained careful distinctions between laws that could be overridden by sufficient divine authority and structural features of reality that existed independently of any authority's will. The directional prohibition on ascent from the underworld belonged to the second category, which means that Inanna's transgression of it was not merely a legal violation of a divine decree, but a challenge to the structural architecture of the cosmos itself. The premeditation evident in Inanna's preparation for the descent compounds the significance of the transgression. The text of the Descent of Inanna, in the version reconstructed from the largest collection of Nippur fragments by Diane Walkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer for their 1983 collaborative edition, describes Inanna's preparations in detail that mirrors her preparations for the visit to the Abzu. She abandons her 7 temples, collects the 7 divine attributes of her queenship, and instructs her servant Ninshuber to set up a lament for her if she has not returned after 3 days and 3 nights, petitioning Enlil, Nanna, and finally Enki for her rescue. This preparatory instruction to Ninshuber is the most diagnostically significant element in the entire text for purposes of establishing premeditation, because it demonstrates that Inanna entered the underworld with advanced knowledge that she might not be able to return under her own power, and with a pre-arranged rescue mechanism designed to circumvent the structural impossibility she was deliberately about to violate. She did not stumble into the underworld's finality. She engineered a planned violation of the cosmos's most fundamental directional principle, with a backup recovery mechanism in place before she descended. The Sumerian scribes who preserved this preparatory sequence were documenting not a divine adventure, but a carefully planned act of cosmic boundary violation by a being who understood exactly what she was violating and had already arranged to escape its consequences through mechanisms she had prepared in advance. The legal implications of this premeditation, within a tradition that documented divine violations with the precision of administrative court records, make the subsequent absence of any punishment record not merely puzzling, but structurally impossible to explain through conventional historical analysis. The legal dimensions of Inanna's underworld descent become most apparent not in her initial transgression, but in what happens at each of the 7 gates through which she must pass to reach the underworld's interior. The gatekeeper Neti reports Inanna's arrival to the queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal, who issues a specific judicial instruction: Inanna must be processed through the 7 gates according to the rites of the underworld. At each gate, Neti removes a specific divine attribute from Inanna's person, and at each gate Inanna demands explanation, and at each gate the identical answer is given. The rites of the underworld are perfect and may not be questioned. The 7 removals strip from Inanna her royal crown, her lapis lazuli measuring rod and line, her lapis lazuli necklace, the sparkling stones at her breast, her golden ring, her breastplate, and her garment of queenship. Within Sumerian administrative and legal traditions, each of these items represented not a costume accessory but a formal token of divine authority and jurisdictional claim, making the 7 removals a precise legal procedure for stripping a divine being of all legitimate authority before judgment. The identification of each removed attribute with a specific category of divine authority is not a modern scholarly interpolation, but a correspondence encoded directly in the texts themselves. The royal crown, designated in Sumerian as the Aga, is consistently associated in administrative tablets from Nippur and Ur with the Emir of kingship, the operational code that generated the social reality of royal authority. Its removal did not merely alter Inanna's appearance. Within the operational logic of the Mi framework, removing the Aga functionally suspended the institutional authority it carried. The lapis lazuli measuring rod and line, the Gidda and the Numen, carried equally specific institutional significance. Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University, in his 1987 analysis of Sumerian administrative instruments, published in the journal Zeitschrift für Archaeology, demonstrated that the measuring rod and line were the primary instruments of divine surveying authority in Mesopotamian institutional tradition, representing the deity's claim to define and delimit sacred space and territorial jurisdiction. Their removal from Inanna at the 2nd gate was therefore not a stripping of decorative jewellery, but a formal legal procedure suspending her territorial authority over any domain she might claim in the underworld. The sequence of removals across 7 gates thus constitutes what Sumerian administrative tradition would recognize as a comprehensive judicial divestiture, systematically removing each category of authority that would otherwise allow Inanna to contest the underworld's jurisdiction over her person. The formula that accompanies each removal repays careful linguistic analysis because it contains a legal argument embedded within what appears to be a simple liturgical refrain. The statement that the rites of the underworld are perfect and may not be questioned employs Sumerian grammatical constructions that appear in a specific and identifiable category of administrative text. The formal justification statements appended to judicial determinations from Nippur's Temple Court Archive. When a Nippur court issued a judgment that a party might contest, the record of that judgment was often followed by a formulaic statement asserting the completeness and finality of the proceeding. The grammatical form of this assertion, employing what Sumerian linguists classify as the perfective, completive aspect with a modal suffix indicating prohibition against review, is precisely the form used in the 7-gate formula. The Sumerian scribes who composed this narrative were not merely creating a ritualistic atmosphere of mysterious repetition. They were encoding a specific legal claim that the gate proceedings constituted a formally complete judicial divestiture whose validity could not be challenged by any authority inside or outside the underworld. This legal encoding means that by the time Inanna reaches Ereshkigal's throne room, she has already been processed through a complete and formally unchallengeable legal procedure that has suspended every category of authority she possessed. She arrives before the Underworld's queen not as a powerful visiting goddess, but as a being who has been judicially reduced to zero institutional standing, making whatever she does next not the action of a powerful divine authority, but the action of an entity that the Underworld's legal system has already processed and formally stripped of all jurisdictional claims. What Inanna does upon reaching the throne room of the Underworld represents the third of her documented violations, and the tablets describe it in language of directional precision that carries specific legal meaning within the Sumerian textual tradition. The text states that Inanna entered the throne room, that Ereshkigal rose from her seat, and that Inanna sat in Ereshkigal's place without invitation or authorization. Scholars including Diane Wolkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer, whose collaborative translation and commentary was published in 1983, have interpreted this act within the mythological framework of divine encounter, but the legal implications within the Sumerian judicial tradition are more specific than their analysis acknowledged. In the administrative texts from Nippur and other major Sumerian centres, the throne was not merely furniture. It was the seat of jurisdictional mandate. To sit upon a divine throne was to formally claim its judicial authority. The throne rooms of Sumerian temples served as courts of law, and the act of occupying the throne was the legal act of assuming jurisdiction over the cases before it. The legal significance of throne occupation in Sumerian institutional tradition is established across a body of administrative and literary evidence that extends well beyond the Underworld narrative. The royal hymns from Ur's Third Dynasty period, several of which are preserved in the Nippur scribal archive, consistently employ throne-sitting language as the formal designation for the assumption of judicial authority over a specific territory. The hymns of Shulgi, the second king of the Third Dynasty of Ur, use the verb tush, to sit, in its throne-specific form as the primary verbal designation for his assumption of royal judicial authority over each city he incorporated into his domain. To sit upon a city's divine throne was the administrative act of extending royal jurisdiction over that city's divine court proceedings. Netti's report to Ereshkigal about Inanna's arrival describes the arriving goddess in terms that match the formal language of a royal visitation announcement in Sumerian diplomatic correspondence, suggesting that Inanna's entry into the underworld was framed as an official assertion of authority from the moment of her arrival. Against this backdrop, her act of sitting upon Ereshkigal's throne after being formally divested of all her own institutional authority at the Seven Gates represents a legal paradox of extraordinary dimensions. A being who has been judicially stripped of all jurisdictional claims is attempting to assume the most fundamental jurisdictional claim available in the underworld system, the claim of the judge's seat itself. The administrative texts from Maori, excavated by André Parrot between 1933 and 1955, provide specific comparative evidence for the legal consequences of unauthorized throne occupation in Mesopotamian institutional practice. Several Maori tablets document episodes in which local governors occupied royal thrones during the absence of higher authorities, and the legal responses recorded in the royal correspondence treat these occupations not as symbolic gestures but as formal assertions of jurisdictional claim requiring explicit legal response to resolve. The language used to describe these occupations and their consequences provides a precise institutional parallel for interpreting Inanna's throne usurpation within the same legal framework. The Maori evidence confirms that unauthorized throne occupation was a recognized category of institutional violation in Mesopotamian legal tradition, with defined procedural responses. The fact that the Underworld narrative documents Inanna's usurpation with the same directional precision used in administrative accounts of unauthorized throne occupation, and that the response it generates from Ereshkigal and the Anunna judges is described in terms matching those administrative procedural responses, places the episode firmly within the domain of institutional record rather than free mythological invention. The throne usurpation was the act that triggered the formal judicial response of the Underworld's court, and what followed was not divine punishment in the mythological sense, but a formal legal proceeding administered by a court of recognized competence. Following the throne usurpation, the text describes the judicial response of Ereshkigal and the great judges of the underworld known as the Anunna of the Kur, 7 divine beings whose authority over matters of underworld law is established in multiple independent textual traditions, and who are explicitly distinguished from the Anunnaki of the heavenly realm. They fix their eyes upon Inanna in what the text calls the look of death, and speak against her, the word that afflicts the guilty. She is struck with disease. She is hung on a peg. The Nippur tablets, as reconstructed from fragments distributed across museums in Philadelphia, Istanbul and Baghdad, describe Inanna hanging on the peg as a corpse for 3 days and 3 nights. This was not imprisonment or temporary punishment. In Sumerian legal tradition, the judgment of the Anunna in the underworld was understood as the absolute and final judicial determination of a competent divine court, with the irreversibility of the judgment guaranteed by the same structural principle that made ascent from the underworld cosmically impossible. The dead do not return, and those properly sentenced by the Anunna cannot escape their sentence by definition. The juridical authority of the 7 Anunna judges of the underworld is established in the Sumerian literary tradition with specificity that distinguishes them from the broader Anunnaki pantheon, and attributes to them a category of judicial competence that operates independently of the divine council at Nippur. The Descent of Inanna texts consistently refer to them as the 7 judges, using the Sumerian term dikud in its plural form with a specialized determinative that appears only in contexts designating divine rather than human judicial authority. Mark Cohen of Hebrew Union College, in his 1988 study of Sumerian liturgical texts, observed that the 7 underworld judges are consistently portrayed across multiple independent textual traditions as a court whose determinations carry the same finality as structural cosmic laws, operating not as subordinate agents of the divine council at Nippur, but as an independent judicial authority within their own domain. This judicial independence is crucial for understanding both the validity of the sentence administered against Inanna and the implications of her subsequent escape from it. The Anunna of the Kur were not a subordinate committee whose decisions could be overturned by appeal to a higher Nippur authority. They were the competent and final judicial authority over all matters within the underworld's jurisdiction, and any being who had been processed through the 7 gates and subjected to their court had, by definition, entered a jurisdiction from which no external appeal was available. The mechanism of the punishment itself, the look of death, the word that afflicts the guilty, the disease, and the hanging on the peg corresponds to specific categories of judicial action documented in Sumerian legal texts from Nippur's court archive. The look of death and the word of judgment appear in lamentation texts as the twin instruments of divine judicial determination, analogous to the formal pronouncement and recording of a verdict in human court proceedings. The subsequent physical afflictions, disease and hanging, correspond to specific categories of divine punishment prescribed in the legal framework for offences against cosmic order. The hanging on a peg in particular carries a specific institutional meaning that Bent Alster of the University of Copenhagen identified in his 1975 study of Sumerian proverbs. The peg, or gag, was the physical instrument on which condemned items were displayed in Sumerian temple administration, the location where things that had been formerly removed from active use were placed pending permanent disposition. Inanna hung on the peg was not merely a corpse. She was an item that had been formally adjudicated, removed from the category of active divine agents, and placed in the institutional position of a condemned object awaiting final disposal. The legal precision of this imagery confirms that the judgment of the Anunna was not a mythological episode of divine violence, but a formally complete judicial proceeding administered by a competent court, resulting in a determination of permanent removal from the category of active existence. The problem for all subsequent attempts to explain the absence of any punishment record for Inanna's other violations is precisely this. She was already sentenced. A competent court of final jurisdiction had already determined her fate. Her subsequent escape from that determination was therefore not merely a fourth violation of divine law, but a circumvention of a sentence that the cosmic structure itself was supposed to make inescapable. The fourth violation follows necessarily from the third, but represents a distinct and more fundamental transgression of cosmic law, because Inanna's return from the underworld is not a miraculous exception to the prohibition against ascending from death, but a deliberate circumvention of a judicial sentence properly administered by a competent divine authority. The mechanism of her return reveals a sophisticated legal strategy embedded within the mythological narrative. Enki creates two beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, the Kurgara and the Galatur, explicitly described as entities that occupy an ambiguous categorical status, neither fully male nor female, neither living nor dead in the conventional sense, and carrying no divine attributes that would subject them to the standard underworld protocols. They enter the underworld not as living beings to whom the gate procedure would apply, and not as dead beings whose entry would be unremarkable, but as categorical exceptions that the seven gates were not designed to process, and they carry the food of life and the water of life with which they revive Inanna's corpse. The legal ingenuity of Enki's rescue mechanism deserves systematic analysis because it reveals a sophisticated understanding of categorical exceptions in Sumerian institutional law that goes far beyond anything the mythological reading of the text has previously examined. The Kurgara and Galatur are described in the text with a linguistic precision that their creator clearly intended to exploit for legal purposes. They are created from the dirt beneath Enki's fingernails, not from clay, not from divine substance, not from any of the recognized materials that constitute legitimate categories of being in Sumerian cosmological classification. They have no me associated with them, no divine attributes, no institutional standing, and no designated function within the cosmic order. They are, in the most precise institutional sense, beings that do not exist within the system of categories that the underworld's gate procedure was designed to process. The seven gates were designed to divest recognized divine beings of their recognized divine attributes. Beings with no recognized divine attributes and no institutional standing presented a categorical problem that the gate procedure could not process, because processing requires a recognized category to process. Enki had created beings that fell into none of the underworld's processing categories, and the gate procedure accordingly had no applicable protocol for handling them. This exploitation of categorical exceptions has precise parallels in Sumerian administrative law. The Nippur tablet collection, includes several documents from the Old Babylonian period that record legal disputes in which parties invoked categorical ambiguities to escape the application of standard legal procedures, claiming that their situation fell outside the defined categories to which a given law applied. The administrative response to such claims, documented in the court records, was typically one of two options. Either the court extended its categories to encompass the new case through analogical reasoning, or it deferred to a higher authority for a ruling on the applicable category. What the Kagara and Galata exploit is a circumstance in which neither option was available to the Underworld court. The categorical gap they occupied was created by Enki, the god of wisdom, and the divine figure most closely associated with knowledge of institutional categories and their boundaries, who designed beings specifically to fall through the gaps in the Underworld's categorical framework. The rescue was not a miracle. It was a legally sophisticated exploitation of a categorical loophole engineered by the divine figure most qualified to identify and exploit such loopholes, operating on behalf of a being who had prearranged this rescue before descending. The premeditation that this implies compounds every aspect of the fourth violation, because it demonstrates that Inanna's circumvention of the Anunna's judicial sentence was not an improvised response to unexpected circumstances, but the execution of a plan that had been prepared before the sentence was even administered. Inanna's return from the Underworld was not unconditional, and the condition attached to it represents the setup for the fifth and arguably most morally troubling violation in her documented record. The cosmic law of the Underworld, preserved in the tablet tradition with a consistency that indicates its foundational status in Sumerian religious thought, required that no being ascend from the Kur unless a substitute descended to take its place. The Gala, the underworld demons who escort Inanna back to the upper world, are described in the Nippur tablets with extraordinary specificity. They know no food, they know no drink, they accept no flower offerings, they accept no libations, they carry a staff, and they lead away the wife from the embrace of her husband and snatch the son from the knee of his father. They are, in essence, described as impartial executors of underworld law with no capacity for mercy, negotiation, or deviation from their mandate. Their function was to ensure compliance with the substitute requirement, and they exercised that function by accompanying Inanna throughout the upper world until she identified and formally designated the being who would take her place in the great below. The substitute requirement, known in Sumerian as the Erim, represents one of the most precisely documented cosmic laws in the entire Sumerian textual tradition, appearing across multiple independent compositions in forms that establish its foundational status with unusual consistency. The law's logic within the Sumerian cosmological framework follows directly from the structural principle that no being may ascend from the underworld, because if the prohibition on ascent is a structural feature of cosmic architecture rather than a legal rule, then Inanna's permitted return requires a structural compensation. The cosmic balance maintained by the underworld's population must be preserved by a replacement input that offsets the unauthorized output her return represents. The substitute requirement is therefore not a legal penalty imposed upon Inanna for her escape, but a structural necessity required by the same cosmic principles that made her imprisonment valid. The Gala who enforce it are not punishing agents acting on behalf of the Anunna court, but mechanisms of structural enforcement operating to maintain the cosmic balance that Inanna's return has disrupted. This distinction is legally significant because it means that the substitute requirement is not a lesser consequence, substituting for a greater punishment that has been waived. It is a separate structural necessity that exists independently of and in addition to whatever legal consequences the Divine Council at Nippur might impose for the accumulated violations Inanna has committed in the course of her descent, judgment, and return. The Gala themselves are described in the Nippur tablets using language that places them in a specific institutional category within the Sumerian bureaucratic cosmology. Dina Katz of the University of Leiden, in her 2003 study of Sumerian underworld concepts, demonstrated through systematic textual analysis that the Gala occupy a position in the underworld's administrative hierarchy analogous to the role of enforcement officers in Sumerian human administrative tradition, beings whose authority derived entirely from their function as executors of a specific legal obligation, and who possessed no discretionary authority to modify, delay, or waive the obligations they were mandated to enforce. Their incapacity for mercy is not a character trait in the mythological sense, but an institutional designation. They are described as knowing no food and no drink, accepting no offerings, in precisely the terms used in administrative texts to describe officials whose institutional role prohibited them from accepting payments or gifts that might compromise their function. The Gala are corruption proof by definition, beings whose institutional design excluded the possibility of deviation from their mandate, and this incorruptibility is exactly what the substitute requirement's structural enforcement function demanded. What follows from Inanna's return in the company of these institutionally incorruptible enforcement agents is the episode that represents the fifth and most legally straightforward of her violations in its character as an abuse of discretionary authority, the selection and condemnation of Dumuzid as her substitute, on grounds that the text itself presents as personal resentment rather than any legally cognizable justification. The cosmic balance required a substitute. Nothing in the substitute requirement specified the criteria by which a substitute should be selected, and into that unspecified space, Inanna introduced a determination based entirely on personal grievance, transforming a structural cosmic necessity into an instrument of targeted vengeance against an innocent party whose only documented offence was sitting on his throne in magnificent garments rather than in the mourning dress that Inanna apparently expected. The fifth violation in Inanna's documented record is in many ways the most legally troubling, because it involves the active condemnation of an innocent party who'd committed no violation of divine law and whose fate Inanna determined based on personal resentment rather than juridical procedure. The text records that as Inanna passed through the cities of Sumer accompanied by the Gala, she encountered her husband Dumuzid on his throne in Bad Tibera, wearing magnificent garments and sitting in splendour, rather than in the mourning dress appropriate to a spouse who had been absent in the underworld. Inanna fixed upon him the eye of death, spoke against him the word of wrath, and instructed the Gala, "This one, take this one." Thorkild Jacobsen of Harvard University, in his 1976 examination of Mesopotamian religious history, observed the disturbing legal dimension of this condemnation. The substitute requirement demanded that Inanna provide a replacement being for the underworld. It did not specify that the replacement had to be guilty of any transgression, but within the broader framework of Sumerian divine law, which the administrative texts from Nippur demonstrate was grounded in principles of causal proportionality and evidentiary justification. The condemnation of an innocent party to permanent death as a substitute for one's own unauthorized actions represented a fundamental violation of divine justice. The Sumerian legal framework that makes Dumuzid's condemnation a violation, rather than merely an unfortunate choice, is established across a body of administrative and literary evidence whose consistency across different periods and institutions demonstrates its foundational status in Mesopotamian jurisprudence. The law codes and administrative court records from Nippur, and Lagash consistently operate on a principle that modern legal systems would recognize as proportionality. Consequences must bear a defined relationship to the transgression that generates them, and punishment may not be imposed upon parties who bear no causal relationship to the transgression being addressed. The Inanna Law Code, the oldest surviving written law code in human history, dating to approximately 2100 BC and recovered in fragmentary form from Nippur, explicitly prohibits the imposition of severe penalties upon innocent parties as compensation for the offences of guilty ones. This prohibition was not a novel legal innovation by Ur-Nama, but a codification of principles already established in Sumerian administrative practice, as demonstrated by the earlier court records from Lagash that apply identical proportionality reasoning to disputed cases without citing it as a new legal rule. Dumuzid had committed no transgression. His failure to wear mourning dress, the proximate cause of Inanna's rage against him, was not a violation of any documented divine law, and certainly not a violation that carried the cosmic penalty of permanent death. The Gala themselves, described in the texts as incorruptible executors of the substitute law, were empowered to enforce the requirement that a substitute be provided but possessed no authority to evaluate the justice of Inanna's selection. Their institutional design, which made them incapable of mercy or deviation from their mandate, made them equally incapable of questioning whether the selection met any standard of evidentiary justification. Inanna exploited this incapacity deliberately, using the Gala's inability to evaluate her selection as the mechanism through which an unjust condemnation could be converted into an apparently legitimate enforcement action. The subsequent traditions surrounding Dumuzid's fate reveal that the Sumerian scribal tradition was aware of the injustice embedded in this condemnation and preserved responses to it that indicate the violation generated precisely the kind of ongoing cosmic disruption that violations of divine justice were understood to produce. The Nippur tablets preserve a continuation of the Dumuzid narrative in what scholars designate as the dream of Dumuzid and his sister, compositions that describe Dumuzid's prophetic foreknowledge of his condemnation, his attempted flight, and his sister Geshtinanna's efforts to protect him. Bent Olster of the University of Copenhagen, in his 1972 study of the Dumuzid compositions, noted that the narrative of Geshtinanna's intercession and the eventual compromise by which Dumuzid and Geshtinanna alternate 6 months each in the Underworld represents a secondary resolution that was not part of the original substitute mechanism, but was imposed as an external correction to what the tradition apparently recognized as a disproportionate original outcome. This secondary resolution is legally significant because it documents a divine response to the injustice of Dumuzid's condemnation, a mitigation imposed upon the system to correct an outcome that violated proportionality principles, but it is a mitigation imposed through narrative continuation rather than through formal legal proceeding. There is no tablet recording a divine council review of Inanna's selection. There is no formal challenge to her exercise of discretionary authority in designating the substitute. There is no punishment record for the 5th violation, just as there is none for the preceding 4, and the pattern of their collective absence is now systematic enough to constitute evidence of deliberate suppression rather than accidental loss. The figure of Dumuzid occupies an unusual position in the Sumerian tradition, because he appears in both the literary texts as Inanna's divine husband, and in the Sumerian king list as an actual historical ruler, a dual presence that has generated significant scholarly debate about the boundary between mythology and history in early Mesopotamian records. The Well-Blundell prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and dating to approximately 2017 BC, includes Dumuzid the Shepherd in the antediluvian section of the King List, with a reign of 36,000 years, and again in the post-flood section as a king of Uruk, the reign of 100 years. Archaeological excavations at Bad Tibera, identified with ancient Patibera in southern Mesopotamia and conducted by various teams throughout the 20th century, have uncovered remains consistent with a significant early dynastic settlement of approximately 2900 to 2600 BC that corresponds to the historical period when Dumuzid appears in administrative records, and the site's substantial evidence for pastoral and agricultural economic organization aligns with Dumuzid's identification as the shepherd in the literary tradition. The archaeological record from Bad Tibera requires careful interpretation because the site has not been subjected to the systematic large-scale excavation that Nippur, Ur, and Uruk received during the major expedition programs of the early 20th century. Survey work conducted by the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage in the 1980s, supplemented by remote sensing surveys using satellite imagery, analyzed by teams at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in the 1990s, has confirmed the site's substantial size and multi-period occupation, while revealing architectural remains consistent with a major temple complex of the early dynastic period. The presence of a significant temple complex at Bad Tibera during the period corresponding to Dumuzid's appearance in administrative records supports the interpretation of the King List entry, not as pure mythological invention, but as a tradition preserving memory of an actual historical figure who was subsequently incorporated into the divine mythology associated with Inanna. The dual appearance of Dumuzid in the King List, once as an antediluvian ruler with an impossibly long reign, and once as a post-flood king with a historically plausible reign of 100 years, matches a pattern that Piotr Michalowski of the University of Michigan identified in his 2004 analysis of the King List tradition as a systematic practice of incorporating historical figures into mythological time frames to establish their divine legitimacy and connection to primordial governance. The significance of Dumuzid's historical reality for the violation narrative lies in what it implies about the nature of the events recorded. If Dumuzid was a historical figure whose traditions were preserved in both administrative records and literary compositions, then his condemnation by Inanna was not merely a mythological episode, but an event with institutional dimensions that affected real governance structures in early dynastic Mesopotamia. Several administrative tablets from Nippur and Ur reference the cult of Dumuzid in terms that treat him as a figure with ongoing institutional presence in temple ritual administration, including specifically the cycle of his disappearance into the underworld and his seasonal return, which was commemorated in temple rituals that required dedicated personnel, material offerings, and calendar coordination across multiple temple administrations. The annual ritual mourning for Dumuzid, documented in temple administrative records from Ur's Third Dynasty period and analysed by Gwendolyn Like of Thames Valley University in her 1998 study of Mesopotamian cities, constituted a significant institutional obligation that affected temple calendars, resource allocation, and priestly assignments across the entire administrative network of southern Mesopotamia. What this means for the violation analysis is that Inanna's condemnation of Dumuzid had consequences that extended from the cosmic framework of the substitute law into the practical institutional life of Sumerian civilization, generating ritual obligations that were maintained for centuries after the event, and that required ongoing institutional resources precisely because the event that created them was understood as historically real rather than purely mythological. The sixth violation in Inanna's documented record is preserved in a composition that scholars designate as Inanna and Ebi, a text presenting extraordinary difficulties for conventional interpretations of divine governance, because it records the systematic destruction of a geographical feature, Mount Ebe, identified with the Hamrin mountain range of modern Iraq, on the grounds that it had not acknowledged Inanna's supremacy. The composition, reconstructed from tablets at the British Museum, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and the University of Pennsylvania Museum, begins with Inanna surveying her domains and encountering the mountain, which grows trees and plants in abundance and houses all manner of creatures, but has not, according to the text, bowed before her. Inanna then petitions Anu for permission to destroy the mountain. What follows is crucial. Anu refuses. The sky god responds explicitly that Inanna should not do battle against the holy mountain, whose fame is widespread and whose radiance is terrible. Anu's refusal establishes this episode not as a mythological drama, but as a formally constituted legal proceeding, in which the supreme deity has been petitioned as a judicial authority, has examined the proposed action, and has rendered a verdict against it. Inanna proceeds with the destruction regardless. The legal framework within which Anu's refusal operates is established by the petition procedure itself, because the act of petitioning Anu for permission constituted Inanna's formal acknowledgement that the proposed action required authorization she did not independently possess. This acknowledgement is institutionally critical. In Sumerian administrative and divine law, the act of submitting a petition to a higher authority was understood as a formal recognition of that authority's jurisdiction over the matter petitioned. An entity who submits a petition and then proceeds without authorization has committed a qualitatively different violation than one who acts without petitioning at all, because the petitioner has already formally acknowledged the authority's right to grant or refuse the permission. Inanna's petition to Anu therefore established through her own institutional action that she recognized Anu's authority to approve or prohibit the destruction of Ebi, making her subsequent defiance of his refusal not merely an act of divine disobedience, but a formal violation of the petition procedure that she herself had invoked. Joan Goodnick Westenholz of the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem, in her 1992 study of Enheduanna's compositions, analysed the Inanna and Ebi text as the primary compositional source for understanding Inanna's relationship with divine authority, noting that the petition and refusal sequence has no parallel in other Sumerian compositions where a deity undertakes destructive action. In all other documented cases, deities either act within their acknowledged authority without petitioning or petition successfully before acting. Inanna's unique pattern of petitioning, receiving a formal refusal, and acting anyway, represents a category of institutional behavior for which the Sumerian legal tradition would have had a specific and unambiguous classification: contempt of divine judicial authority. The physical reality of Mount Ebe, identified with the Hamrin mountain range in what is now northeastern Iraq, adds a geographical dimension to the violation that distinguishes it from the purely cosmic transgressions of the Underworld narrative. The Hamrin range, rising to elevations of approximately 500 meters above sea level and extending approximately 100 kilometers in length, constituted a genuine geographical and ecological boundary in early dynastic Mesopotamia, marking the transition between the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia and the Piedmont regions connecting to the Zagros Mountains. Survey work conducted in the Hamrin Basin by international teams, including the Oriental Institute's work in the 1970s and 80s, preceding the construction of the Hamrin Dam Reservoir, documented extensive evidence of occupation across multiple prehistoric and historic periods that demonstrated the region's continuous significance as a cultural and economic boundary zone. Anu's characterization of the mountain as holy and radiantly terrible likely reflects genuine reverence for a geographical feature that marked significant ecological and political boundaries, making his prohibition on its destruction not merely a divine preference, but a policy determination protecting a feature with recognized cosmological status. Inanna's destruction of this feature following Anu's explicit prohibition therefore had consequences that extended beyond the cosmic into the geographical and ecological, disrupting a boundary whose cosmological status Anu himself had formally affirmed in the act of refusing Inanna's petition. The eighth violation in Inanna's documented record introduces a new category of transgression, because it involves the deliberate manipulation of a divine authority superior to Inanna herself in order to exact disproportionate vengeance against a mortal who rejected her advances on entirely defensible grounds. The episode is preserved most completely in Tablet 6 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, though the Sumerian forerunner traditions in the Nippur collection provide additional context that the Akkadian synthesis omits. Following the hero's return to Uruk, Inanna proposes marriage to Gilgamesh, and his refusal catalogues the fates of her previous consorts, including Dumuzid, the Alalu bird, the lion, the horse, and the shepherd Ishulanu, all of whom suffered documented misfortunes as a consequence of their relationships with the goddess. His argument was legally sound within any evidentiary framework. He cited specific precedents, identified a consistent pattern of harm, and articulated a rational basis for refusal that any impartial judicial authority would have recognized as adequate justification. Inanna's response was to petition Anu for the Bull of Heaven, a divine weapon whose deployment against Uruk would kill hundreds of warriors and devastate a city populated by beings who had committed no violation against any party. The legal character of Gilgamesh's refusal is more precisely established when the text is read, alongside the Sumerian literary tradition concerning the rights and obligations attending divine marriage proposals. Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies, in his 2003 critical edition of the Gilgamesh epic, noted that divine marriage proposals in Mesopotamian literary tradition carried institutional implications beyond the personal relationship, because union with a divine patron was understood to confer specific governance obligations and resource-sharing arrangements upon the accepting party. Gilgamesh's refusal was therefore not merely a personal rejection, but a governance decision by a city ruler who had evaluated the documented consequences of such union for his city's population and determined that the risks outweighed the benefits. The evidence he cited, the specific fates of Dumuzid, the Alalu bird, the lion, the horse, and the shepherd Ishulanu, constituted what Sumerian administrative tradition would recognize as a body of precedent, establishing a pattern of harm attributable to the same source. His argument was, in the terms available to early dynastic Mesopotamian governance, a rational policy determination supported by documented historical evidence, and it was directed at protecting his city's population from consequences he had reasonable grounds to anticipate. Inanna's petition to Anu for the Bull of Heaven in response to this evidentiary refusal constitutes the eighth violation not merely because it is disproportionate, but because it attempted to use the supreme divine authority's power to punish a party for making a legally defensible decision, effectively asking Anu to act as an instrument of retaliation against a mortal who had successfully argued against Inanna's institutional interests using her own record of prior conduct as evidence. Anu's initial hesitation recorded in the text before his eventual capitulation to Inanna's threat to break down the Underworld's gates, is institutionally significant because it demonstrates that the supreme divine authority recognized the impropriety of the request before acceding to it. A divine authority who recognizes the impropriety of a petitioned action and accedes to it anyway under threat has been coerced, and coercion of a judicial authority by a party before it constitutes a violation qualitatively different from simple disobedience. The Bull of Heaven's deployment resulted in the death of hundreds of warriors of Uruk and the devastation of the city's agricultural infrastructure before Enkidu and Gilgamesh killed the divine weapon and thereby committed the transgression that would eventually cost Enkidu his life. The chain of consequences flowing from Inanna's eighth violation thus extended to the death of an innocent party, Enkidu, whose fate was determined by the Divine Council's response to the killing of the bull, which was itself deployed unjustly against a city whose ruler had committed no actionable violation. The eighth violation generated a cascade of institutional consequences across multiple parties who bore no causal relationship to the original refusal that triggered it, constituting precisely the kind of disproportionate harm that Sumerian legal principles were designed to prevent. The ninth, and in many respects most consequential violation in Inanna's documented record, is the one that receives the least direct commentary in modern scholarship, perhaps because it is distributed across the narrative of the descent rather than concentrated in a single dramatic episode. When Inanna descended to the underworld, she did not merely cross a forbidden boundary or challenge an improper legal authority. She abandoned the divine offices that she held as their legitimate custodian. The me that Inanna controlled included not merely titles or decorative attributes, but active operational responsibilities for specific cosmic and social functions. She held the me of queenship over heaven, of the descent to and ascent from the underworld, of the art of the hero, of righteous judgment, of the devastation of cities, of the setting up of lamentations, of the rejoicing of the heart, of deception, and of forthright speech, among dozens more catalogued across multiple Nippur compositions. These were not passive possessions. They were active cosmic responsibilities whose abandonment created measurable disruption to the systems they governed. The operational character of the ME means that their custodian's absence from active duty generated consequences in the systems they governed, and the text of the descent preserves the most direct evidence for the reality of this disruption in a passage that has received insufficient attention in scholarly analysis of the composition. During the period of Inanna's absence in the underworld, the text describes a cessation of sexual activity, reproduction, and the animal fertility that agricultural civilization depended upon. Bulls no longer mounted cows, asses no longer covered jennies, men and women ceased to engage in reproduction. The text presents these cessations not as divine punishments imposed by an external authority, but as automatic consequences of the operational me governing fertility and reproduction having been removed from active custodianship. The me were not merely symbols of Inanna's association with these domains, they were the operational mechanisms that actively generated the phenomena of those domains, and their removal from active management through Inanna's abandonment of her post produced exactly the systemic failures that the operational model of the me would predict. William Hallow of Yale University, in his 1983 survey of Sumerian literary genres, noted this passage as evidence for the Sumerians' understanding of divine offices as actively generative rather than merely symbolic, but did not develop its implications for the violation analysis. The abandonment of the divine post differs from the other 8 violations in a structural way that makes it the most cosmically consequential of all. The preceding 8 violations were discrete events, bounded in time and identifiable in their specific transgression. The abandonment of the post was a continuous condition that persisted for the entire duration of the descent, generating ongoing systemic disruption across every domain governed by the Inanna held. If the Mi functioned as operational codes that actively generated the phenomena of their domains, then every day of Inanna's absence represented not a single violation, but an ongoing failure of the cosmic systems those Mi maintained, compounding in its consequences with each passing interval of custodial absence. The 3 days and 3 nights recorded in the text as the duration of Inanna's death in the underworld would, within this operational framework, represent 3 days and 3 nights during which the operational architecture of Sumerian civilization was running without its primary custodian, generating cascading failures across the interdependent systems of the Mi network. The compound nature of this violation, its distribution across the entire duration of the descent narrative rather than concentration in a single transgressive act, may explain why it has received less direct scholarly attention than the more dramatically concentrated episodes. But its systemic consequences, documented in the text's own account of reproductive and agricultural cessation during Inanna's absence, make it the violation with the most measurable impact on the actual functioning of the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it, and therefore the violation that most urgently required formal legal response from a divine council charged with maintaining the operational integrity of that cosmos. The University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur between 1888 and 1900, followed by subsequent expeditions through the mid-20th century, recovered approximately 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments from the site, the largest single collection of Sumerian literary and administrative documents ever excavated. This archive, whose contents are now distributed among the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, preserves the most comprehensive record of Sumerian religious, literary and legal tradition in existence. Among its contents are texts that record divine judgments against multiple gods who violated cosmic law. The punishment of Enlil for the violation of Ninlil is preserved in extraordinary procedural detail. The binding of king following events described in the Babylonian creation epic is documented with juridical specificity. Nergal's irregular seizure of underworld authority is the subject of formal divine diplomatic correspondence preserved across multiple tablet copies. But the Nippur archive contains no punishment decree, no divine judgment, and no recorded consequence for any of Inanna's 9 documented violations across any tablet copy from any excavation at any site. The significance of this absence is sharpened considerably when the specific punishment records that do survive are examined for what they reveal about the Sumerian scribal tradition's standard approach to divine legal proceedings. The Enlil and Ninlil composition, preserved in multiple copies across the Nippur collection and analysed by Hermann Behrens of the University of Pennsylvania in his 1978 monograph on the text, documents the Divine Assembly's response to Enlil's violation of Ninlil with procedural specificity that matches the administrative court records from Nippur's Human Judicial Archive. The Assembly deliberates, reaches consensus, and issues a formal determination of banishment. The determination is recorded on clay, distributed across the institutional network, and preserved in the scribal curriculum as a standard educational text across the Old Babylonian period. The binding of Kingu, while embedded within the larger narrative of the Enuma Elish rather than presented as a standalone judicial record, employs legal terminology throughout the binding episode that demonstrates awareness of formal judicial procedure, including the specific language of verdict pronouncement and the physical act of binding as the institutional expression of a judicial determination. Nergal's seizure of underworld authority generates a body of divine diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Amarna archive, including tablets discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt by Flinders Petrie's expedition in 1891 and 2, and analysed by Shlomo Israel of Tel Aviv University in his 2001 study, that documents the formal negotiation and resolution of the unauthorized power seizure through recognized divine institutional channels. Each of these cases demonstrates the same pattern. Violation generates formal institutional response. Response is recorded. Record is preserved and copied. Inanna's 9 violations generate none of this pattern across any surviving source. The statistical dimensions of this absence deserve explicit statement. The Nippur archive contains literary compositions in sufficient quantity and variety that the absence of a specific composition type cannot be attributed to the general limitations of the collection. The archive preserves not only major narrative compositions, but also fragmentary texts, administrative documents, school exercise tablets, lexical lists, and incidental records that collectively represent a cross-section of Sumerian textual culture across several centuries of continuous production. Within this cross-section, the divine punishment record for Enlil survives not as a single unique text, but as a multiplier-tested composition whose standard form can be reconstructed from the convergence of independent copies. If a divine punishment record for Inanna had existed and occupied a similar position in the scribal curriculum, the probability that not a single fragment of it would survive across 30,000 tablets from the primary scribal archive of Sumerian civilization is, as Gerald Cooper of Johns Hopkins University observed in his 1992 survey of Sumerian literary genres, effectively negligible under any model of random preservation loss. The absence is not a gap in the archive, it is a feature of the archive, and features of archives that contradict the expected pattern of their own institutional logic require explanations that address the institutional processes that produced them rather than the physical accidents of clay preservation. The composition known to scholars as the Cursing of a God provides a comparative case that illuminates the Nippur archive's standard approach to recording divine legal responses to violations of cosmic order. This text, analysing the destruction of the Akkadian Empire's capital as a consequence of Naram-Sin's violation of Enlil's sacred precinct at Nippur, preserves the Divine Council's deliberation. The specific violations cited as grounds for the cursive determination, the involvement of 8 named divine figures in pronouncing the curse, and the detailed catalogue of consequences imposed upon a god as institutional punishment. The level of procedural documentation in the Cursing of a God, including the citation of specific violations, the identification of the adjudicating authorities, and the precise enumeration of the consequent punishments, represents the standard format for divine legal response as the Nippur archive preserves it. Applying this standard to Inanna's case produces a precise inventory of what the missing punishment record should contain: identification of each violation, citation of the relevant me or divine law violated, identification of the adjudicating authority, the deliberative process by which the Divine Council reached its determination, the specific punishment determined, and the institutional mechanism for its enforcement. None of these elements survive for any of Inanna's 9 violations. The archive that preserves this complete procedural format for human kings who offended divine law preserves nothing comparable for the divine being who violated divine law 9 separate times across multiple independent textual traditions. To appreciate the full significance of the missing punishment record, it is necessary to understand how divine jurisprudence actually functioned in the Sumerian institutional framework. Because the Sumerians did not conceive of divine authority as arbitrary power that could ignore documented violations without generating an explanatory record. The divine council that convened at Nippur's Eka temple complex was a legal institution with defined procedures, documented precedents, and preserved outcomes. Administrative texts from Nippur describe the divine assembly as a functioning legislative and judicial body that met at specific times, entertained petitions and complaints, deliberated through a process requiring consensus among senior divine figures, and produced written determinations that were promulgated and preserved on clay tablets distributed to affiliated institutions. The composition known as the Lament for the Destruction of Sumer and Ur, while primarily mourning literature, preserves descriptions of divine council proceedings that illuminate its procedural character with unusual specificity. The assembly debates, votes through a process of consensus building, and produces binding determinations whose force not even the most powerful divine beings could legitimately resist. The procedural architecture of the divine council is documented across multiple independent Sumerian compositions in ways that allow its institutional structure to be reconstructed with considerable precision. The assembly convened at Nippur's Eka, designated in Sumerian texts as the Mountain House, the earthly seat of Enlil's executive authority and the primary venue for divine legislative and judicial proceedings. The council's membership, as reconstructed by Thorkild Jakobsen in his 1976 study of Mesopotamian intellectual history, comprised two tiers: a senior group of approximately 7 great gods who held primary deliberative authority, and a larger assembly of approximately 50 divine beings who constituted the broader legislative body. Decisions required consensus among the senior group and ratification by the larger assembly, a procedural structure that appears in multiple independent texts describing divine council proceedings and that mirrors the documented structure of human city-state assemblies in early dynastic Mesopotamia. Oke Sjöberg of the University of Pennsylvania, in his catalogue of Sumerian literary texts published across multiple volumes of Zeitschrift für Assyriologie, beginning in 1972, identified a specific category of texts that he designated as divine assembly narratives, compositions whose primary subject was the proceedings of the divine council itself, rather than the actions of individual divine figures. These texts preserve the procedural vocabulary of divine deliberation, including the specific Sumerian terms for the convening of the assembly, the presentation of petitions, the process of deliberative consensus, and the formal pronouncement of binding determinations. What the divine assembly narrative tradition demonstrates most clearly, for purposes of the missing punishment analysis, is that the council's authority was not contingent upon the cooperation of the party subject to its determination. The assembly that determined Enlil's banishment did not require Enlil's consent to enforce it. The binding of Kingu was executed as a direct institutional act, rather than as a negotiated settlement. The divine council's enforcement authority was presented in these texts as inherent to its institutional character, operative through the collective will of the assembled divine beings, without requiring the subject's participation in the enforcement mechanism. This institutional autonomy is directly relevant to the question of why no punishment record for Inanna exists, because it eliminates one potential explanation, that the council declined to act because it lacked the practical ability to enforce a determination against Inanna. The texts that document the council's enforcement actions against other divine figures established that the assembly possessed and exercised enforcement authority over powerful divine beings. The absence of a recorded punishment for Inanna therefore cannot be explained by reference to practical enforcement limitations. It must be explained by reference to either the Council's deliberate decision not to act or the suppression of records documenting a decision that was in fact made and implemented. Among the divine figures who should have responded to Inanna's theft of the Emi, Enki presents the most analytically puzzling case of inexplicable passivity, because the tablets that record his immediate and vigorous response to the initial theft, through the dispatch of sea monsters, storms, and divine messengers, also document his complete cessation of any legal action once the Emi arrived safely in Uruk. Enki files no formal complaint with the Ekor assembly. He makes no petition to Anu. He does not approach the Divine Council with a request for adjudication of the unauthorized transfer of civilization's foundational codes. The tablets are silent on any further Enkian response to the permanent loss of the Emi from his custody. This silence is particularly striking given what the texts elsewhere establish about Enki's procedural awareness. Bent Alster of the University of Copenhagen, in his examination of Sumerian wisdom literature, observed that Enki's consistent role across the textual tradition is that of the divine figure who finds legal and creative solutions to cosmic problems, which makes his failure to pursue any legal remedy for the theft of the Me not merely surprising, but structurally inconsistent with the character that the texts otherwise preserve. Enki's passivity following the Me theft requires careful examination against the range of legal options available to him within the Sumerian institutional framework, because the failure to pursue any of those options, despite both the means and the evident motivation to do so, constitutes one of the most diagnostic features of the entire punishment gap. The most straightforward available remedy was a formal complaint to the Divine Assembly at Nippur, a petition procedure that Enki was demonstrably qualified and positioned to use. The texts elsewhere document Enki petitioning higher divine authorities on matters of significantly less consequence than the loss of over 100 operational codes governing civilization's foundational functions. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki petitions and negotiates with the Divine Assembly over the creation of humanity and the conditions of the flood with procedural sophistication that demonstrates intimate familiarity with the Assembly's petition procedures. His failure to employ these same procedures to recover the Emi is therefore not explicable by reference to procedural ignorance or institutional inexperience. A second available remedy was direct appeal to Anu, bypassing the Assembly and petitioning the supreme divine authority as an emergency measure appropriate to the scale of the Me theft. Again, the texts establish that Enki was institutionally qualified to make such an appeal and had done so on other matters. The sustained absence of any such appeal in any surviving text across any tradition that preserves the Me theft narrative is therefore not a gap in the evidence, but a documented pattern of inaction whose explanation must address why. The most procedurally sophisticated figure in the Sumerian pantheon chose to absorb the permanent loss of civilization's operational architecture without pursuing any of the legal remedies available to him. The most probable explanation, which the pattern of silences across multiple divine figures begins to establish as a systematic feature of the tradition rather than an individual peculiarity, is that Enki's inaction was not voluntary in the sense of being freely chosen, but was instead the result of a constraint whose nature the texts preserve in encoded rather than explicit form. The constraint that best explains the observed pattern is an authority relationship between Enki and Inanna, that placed her actions outside the jurisdiction of his available legal remedies, not because she was his superior in the divine hierarchy, where she was not, but because the me she obtained from him included the operational codes that governed the mechanisms through which his legal remedies would have operated. The theft of the Emi did not merely deprive Enki of authority symbols. It potentially gave Inanna operational control over the institutional mechanisms through which any challenge to her possession of those me would have to proceed, creating a recursive institutional trap in which the very act of pursuing legal remedy would require the cooperation of operational systems now under the control of the party being challenged. The second divine figure who should have acted against Inanna's accumulating violations is Enlil, the god of wind and storm who occupied the position of chief executive within the Sumerian divine hierarchy, and whose temple at Nippur served as the seat of the divine council. Enlil's relationship with Inanna in the tablet tradition reveals an asymmetry of response that demands systematic explanation. This is the same divine authority who, according to multiple Sumerian texts, ordered the flood that destroyed humanity and justified his action by citing humanity's failure to observe proper boundaries. He is the authority who exiled the moon god Nanna following a procedural violation involving unauthorized movement across divine territories. He is the judge whose determinations the texts consistently present as binding cosmic law. And yet when Inanna descended to the underworld without permission, violated Ereshkigal's sovereignty, circumvented a properly administered judicial sentence of the Anunna, returned from the cosmically irreversible, condemned an innocent spouse to permanent death, defied Anu's explicit ruling regarding Abi, destroyed Abi regardless, deployed the Bull of Heaven against an innocent urban population, and abandoned her divine post during the descent, Enlil produced no recorded response across any tablet tradition from any site. The asymmetry between Enlil's documented willingness to act against other violators and his complete inaction regarding Inanna's 9 violations is not subtle or ambiguous. It is one of the most dramatic asymmetries in the entire Sumerian textual tradition, and its systematic character across 9 separate violations and across multiple textual traditions spanning several centuries of continuous copying eliminates the possibility that it represents accidental narrative omission. Enlil's punishment of Nanna, the moon god, for a procedural violation involving unauthorized movement between the city of and the assembly at Nippur is documented in the composition known as the Journey of Nanna to Nippur, analysed by Oke Scherberg in his 1960 study of the text. The violation was procedural, the harm limited, and the punishment swift and formally administered. The contrast with Enlil's non-response to Inanna's 9 violations, several of which involved direct defiance of decisions made by divine authorities senior to Enlil himself, is so extreme that it constitutes evidence not of Enlil's general tolerance for divine violations, but of a specific constraint on his authority in relation to Inanna that the texts have preserved in the form of conspicuous procedural absence. The nature of this constraint becomes clearer when Enlil's relationship with Inanna across multiple compositions is examined systematically rather than episode by episode. The royal hymns of Enheduanna, Sargon of Akkad's daughter and the world's first named literary author, whose compositions are preserved on tablets from Nippur and and were published by William Hallow and Jan van Dyck in their 1968 Yale University Press edition, present a sustained theological argument for Inanna's authority over Enlil that goes far beyond conventional divine flattery. Enheduanna's hymns argue explicitly that Inanna's power encompasses and supersedes the authority of the other great gods, including Enlil, and that her will constitutes a higher cosmic principle than the institutional mechanisms of the divine council. The historical context of these hymns, composed for political purposes during the Sargonic period's consolidation of Akkadian hegemony over Sumerian city-states, gives them a pragmatic institutional dimension. They were composed to establish theological justification for a political order in which Inanna's cult, centered at Uruk-and-Agade, claimed institutional supremacy over Enlil's traditional prerogatives at Nippur. The theological argument Enheduanna constructed to support this political claim required necessarily the suppression of any narrative tradition that documented Enlil successfully challenging Inanna's authority, which is precisely the category of narrative that the punishment records for Inanna's violations would have constituted. The silence of Anu, the supreme sky god and head of the divine council, in the face of Inanna's accumulating violations, is perhaps the most analytically revealing silence in the entire tradition, because the texts that record her transgressions also document Anu's relationship with her in ways that provide the most probable explanation for the missing punishment record. Anu is Inanna's great-grandfather in the divine genealogy that Sumerian texts preserve, and he is also the deity who, in at least 2 documented episodes, actively assists Inanna in pursuing courses of action that compound rather than remedy her violations of divine law. When Inanna petitions Anu for the Bull of Heaven to deploy against Gilgamesh, Anu initially refuses and cites catastrophic consequences for the population of Uruk, demonstrating that he understood both the legal impropriety of the request and its practical consequences. But the text records that when Inanna threatens to break down the gates of the underworld and release its dead to consume the living, Anu capitulates. The supreme judicial authority of the Sumerian Divine Council is here documented as actively assisting a serial violator of divine law in committing yet another violation immediately after declining to prevent it. The threat that produces Anu's capitulation deserves precise analysis because it reveals the specific leverage mechanism that Inanna possessed over the Divine Council's supreme authority, and that leverage mechanism provides the most coherent single explanation for the entire pattern of missing punishment records. Inanna's threat to break down the underworld's gates and release the dead to consume the living was not an idle dramatic gesture. Within the operational logic of the Sumerian cosmological framework, the gates of the underworld were structural features maintaining the separation between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, the same structural separation that made ascent from the underworld a cosmic impossibility. A being who threatened to destroy that structural separation was threatening to collapse the fundamental architecture of the Sumerian universe itself, and the credibility of that threat was established by the fact that Inanna had already demonstrated, through her own descent and return, that she possessed both the will and the capability to violate the structural principles governing the underworld's functioning. Anu faced a being who had already penetrated the underworld, circumvented its judicial proceedings, escaped its structural imprisonment, and returned to the upper world with a capability set that no divine authority had previously exercised. The threat to destroy the underworld's gates was credible, precisely because Inanna's demonstrated record established that she was capable of actions the Divine Council had previously treated as structural impossibilities. The coercion of the Divine Council's supreme authority by this threat constitutes a 10th violation, implicit in the text, distinct from the 9 explicit violations previously catalogued, and it is the violation that most directly illuminates why the punishment records are missing. A divine council whose supreme authority has been coerced into assisting a serial violator has been institutionally compromised in a way that undermines the legitimacy of any subsequent judicial action it might take against that violator. The texts that preserve Anu's capitulation are simultaneously preserving evidence that the institutional mechanism that should have produced Inanna's punishment records had been rendered functionally compromised before several of the most serious violations in her record had even occurred. The council that should have judged Inanna was a council that Inanna had already demonstrated she could coerce, and the missing punishment records may therefore represent not the suppression of proceedings that were conducted and then removed from the archive, but the absence of proceedings that were never initiated because the institutional authority required to initiate them had already been shown to be vulnerable to exactly the kind of coercive pressure that Inanna was uniquely positioned to apply. The transition from Sumerian Inanna to Akkadian Ishtar, which occurred during the Sargonic period beginning approximately 2300 BC, when Akkadian-speaking rulers consolidated power across Mesopotamia, produced a synthesis deity whose documented violations extended significantly beyond the 9 preserved in the Sumerian tradition. The identification of Inanna with Ishtar was not a simple naming convention, but a theological merger that imported both figures' narrative traditions and created a composite who was simultaneously the Sumerian goddess of love and queenship and the Semitic goddess of war, sexual love, and celestial power. The royal hymns of Enheduanna, Sargon's daughter and the first named author in literary history, whose compositions are preserved on tablets from Nippur and Ur and were analysed by Hallow and Van Dyke in their 1968 publication, represent the pivotal moment of this synthesis. These compositions are simultaneously the earliest attributed literary works in human history, and a systematic theological program for establishing Inanna's supreme, divine authority above all other gods, including, crucially, those who held jurisdictional authority over the violations she had accumulated. The theological program embedded within Enheduanna's hymns operates on multiple institutional levels simultaneously, which is what distinguishes them from conventional divine flattery and identifies them as purposive political documents with specific archival consequences. The primary composition, known as the Exaltation of Inanna or Ninmessara, preserved on a tablet designated as CBS 7847 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, does not merely praise Inanna's power in general terms. It systematically reassigns to Inanna the specific categories of authority that belong to other major divine figures, including Enlil's power over storm and destruction, Anu's authority over cosmic order, and Enki's command over the Mi themselves. The reassignment is performed through a series of direct statements in the indicative mood, not the honorific subjunctive of conventional divine praise, asserting as current institutional reality that Inanna holds these authorities. Gerald Cooper of Johns Hopkins University, in his 1990 analysis of Enheduanna's political theology, published in the journal Orientalia, observed that the Ninmessara represents the earliest surviving example of systematic theological revisionism in literary history, a composition whose purpose was to establish a new institutional order by asserting it as already existing within the divine realm. The political consequences of this theological revisionism extended directly to the archival question of Inanna's punishment records, because a theological order in which Inanna superseded the authority of Enlil and effectively held the authority of Anu could not simultaneously preserve textual traditions documenting those figures successfully judging and punishing her for cosmic violations. The Akkadian transformation of Inanna into Ishtar added further layers of complexity to the violation record through the importation of Semitic narrative traditions about the goddess that paralleled the Sumerian accounts, while introducing new episodes and contexts, the Akkadian descent of Ishtar, preserved most completely on a single large tablet designated as K200 from the Kuyunjik collection at the British Museum and published by Reginald Campbell Thompson in his 1900 text edition, compresses and in some respects intensifies the legal dimensions of the Sumerian descent narrative while eliminating several of the procedural details that made the Sumerian version so diagnostically valuable. Where the Sumerian text carefully names each divine attribute removed at each gate, the Akkadian version preserves the structure of the 7 removals but reduces their institutional specificity. Where the Sumerian text records the precise deliberative response of Enki and the specific categorical status of the Kugara and Galatur, the Akkadian version compresses these episodes into shorter narrative units that preserve the events without the institutional detail that reveals their legal dimensions. This pattern of compression across the Akkadian tradition is not uniform across all episodes, but is consistently concentrated on precisely those elements that carry the most explicit legal meaning, suggesting that the Akkadian tradition was not merely summarizing the Sumerian source, but was selectively reducing its legal specificity in ways that obscured the institutional dimensions of the violation record. The Sargonic political program that Enheduanna's hymns advanced required not only the elevation of Inanna's authority, but the progressive obscuring of the institutional framework within which her violations were legible as violations. The Akkadian transformation of her narrative tradition accomplished both objectives simultaneously. It elevated her cosmic status through the synthesis with Ishtar's war and celestial authority, while reducing the institutional specificity that made the Sumerian accounts readable as legal records. Linguistic analysis of the Sumerian text recording Inanna's violations reveals a consistent pattern of terminological precision that distinguishes these narratives from conventional mythological literature and places them within the semantic field of administrative and juridical record-keeping. The Sumerian verb constructions used to describe Inanna's movements and actions in the descent narrative employ grammatical forms that appear almost exclusively in 2 categories of text: actual judicial documents from Nippur's administrative archive and the literary compositions concerning Inanna's activities. Miguel Civil of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, in his analyses of Sumerian legal vocabulary, published across several articles in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies between 1965 and 1992, identified specific verb forms in the Underworld narrative that carry legal rather than merely narrative meaning, including constructions indicating movement against established directional protocols and terminology for the formal transfer of judicial custody that appear in the substitute passage. The concentration of this legal vocabulary in narratives that describe events without recorded legal consequences is itself a form of evidence about the original nature of the complete text tradition. The specific grammatical constructions that Civil identified as legally significant in the descent narrative can be examined in concrete detail because they carry precise institutional meaning within the documented Sumerian legal vocabulary. The verb form used to describe Inanna's departure from her 7 temples at the beginning of the descent is not the standard Sumerian verb for travel or departure, but a specialized construction that appears in administrative dissolution documents when an office holder formally vacates an institutional position, carrying the specific meaning of abandoning a held post with the institutional consequences that such abandonment entails. This is not a common verb deployed metaphorically in a literary context. It is a specialized administrative term whose other occurrences in the Nippur corpus are confined to documents recording the formal termination of institutional appointments, and its use in the descent narrative's opening lines establishes the institutional character of what Inanna is doing at the outset. She is not going on a journey. She is formally vacating a set of institutional positions, which is precisely what the 9th violation consists of. The verb used to describe the Gala's enforcement action when they accompany Inanna through the upper world appears in the same specialized form used in administrative texts from Nippur's court archive to describe the custody escort of parties subject to judicial enforcement proceedings, not the general vocabulary for accompanying or travelling together. The Gala are not accompanying Inanna as companions or guides. The text uses the specific legal vocabulary of custodial enforcement, placing Inanna's entire passage through the upper world in the institutional category of supervised judicial custody. The most linguistically significant passage for purposes of the punishment gap analysis is the substitute designation itself, the moment when Inanna instructs the Gala to take Dumuzid. The Sumerian construction at this point employs a verb form that Civil identified as appearing with high frequency in a very specific category of administrative document: the formal transfer of legal liability from one party to another in civil debt and responsibility proceedings. The construction carries the institutional meaning of designating a party as legally responsible for an obligation previously belonging to another, and its use in the substitute designation passage encodes Inanna's action as a formal legal transfer of her underworld liability to Dumuzid, using the institutional vocabulary of civil obligation transfer rather than the vocabulary of divine command or mythological transformation. The legal precision of this construction is remarkable for what it implies about the text's relationship to actual institutional procedure. The Sumerian scribes who composed or transmitted this narrative were using the same vocabulary they used to record civil liability transfers in Nippur's court archive, embedding a legally precise description of what Inanna was doing within a narrative that otherwise reads as a mythological account of divine adventure. The concentration of this level of legal vocabulary specificity across a narrative that describes 9 distinct institutional violations without any recorded consequence constitutes the strongest textual evidence available that the original complete tradition included consequence records whose legal vocabulary would have matched the violation records in specificity and precision, and whose absence from the surviving tradition reflects institutional management of the archival record rather than accidental loss. The hypothesis that Inanna's punishment records were not merely lost through preservation accidents, but deliberately removed from the archive tradition, requires examination of the physical evidence for selective tablet survival from the Nippur collection, because Sumerian literary compositions were not preserved on single unique tablets, but were copied repeatedly across different periods, at different scribal schools, and for different institutional purposes. A composition that occupied a stable position in the active literary tradition would survive in multiple copies from multiple sites, and the distribution of those copies reflects the composition's status in the scribal curriculum. The texts recording Inanna's violations survive in exactly this pattern of wide multi-copy distribution. The descent of Inanna is known from no fewer than 8 significant tablet fragments recovered from different locations, confirming its status as a core curricular text in Sumerian scribal schools across the full historical range of the tradition. The Inanna and Enki text survives in multiple Nippur copies, The Gilgamesh episode involving Inanna appears in the Babylonian, Ninevite and Hittite versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, demonstrating distribution across centuries and cultures. But in not one of the sites that produced these texts has any tablet been recovered containing a divine judgment against Inanna for any of her 9 documented violations. The physical mechanics of Sumerian archival management provide the framework within which deliberate removal of specific texts becomes institutionally conceivable, because the Nippur scribal archive was not a passive repository, but an actively managed institution whose contents were periodically reviewed, selected, and curated through the scribal curriculum. Eleanor Robson of University College London, in her 2001 study of Old Babylonian scribal education published in the journal Iraq, demonstrated through analysis of scribal exercise tablets from Nippur that the scribal curriculum was not a static canonical list, but a managed selection that was periodically updated by master scribes, who determined which compositions students would copy and thereby perpetuate in the tradition. Compositions that were removed from the curriculum ceased to be copied, and compositions that ceased to be copied left no new tablet versions to replace those lost to physical deterioration. The mechanism for eliminating a text from the ongoing tradition was therefore not the physical destruction of every existing copy, but the administrative decision to exclude it from the scribal curriculum, after which the existing copies would gradually deteriorate without replacement until none remained. This mechanism would leave precisely the pattern of absence observed for Inanna's punishment records. Not a visible gap where destroyed tablets once existed, but a clean absence consistent with a text that was never included in, or was eventually removed from the educational program that sustained the tradition's continuity. The institutional context that would have motivated such a removal is provided by the political history of the Sargonic period and its immediate aftermath, because the theological program advanced by Enheduanna's hymns required ongoing archival management to sustain its claims. A theological assertion that Inanna superseded the authority of all other divine figures could not coexist with a scribal curriculum that regularly required students to copy texts in which those figures successfully judged and punished her. The removal of punishment records from the curriculum would have been a natural institutional complement to the promotion of the exaltation of Inanna as a core curricular text, and the evidence indicates that both processes occurred during the same historical period. The exaltation of Inanna survives in multiple Old Babylonian period copies, demonstrating its successful integration into the scribal curriculum beginning in the period immediately following the Sargonic consolidation. The punishment records that should exist as the institutional counterpart to the violation narratives that do survive in the same curriculum are absent from exactly this period onward, suggesting that their removal from the curriculum and the promotion of the exaltation were complementary archival management decisions made within the same institutional program. The absence of recorded punishment for Inanna's 9 violations does not necessarily mean that resolution was absent from the tradition. It means that, if a resolution existed, it was preserved outside the mainstream Nippur scribal tradition, encoded within compositions that appear to address different subject matter, or contained in tablet collections that have not yet been recovered or identified. Several avenues of investigation suggest that the hidden resolution may be partially recoverable through careful analysis of texts that have not previously been read in this specific context. Fragmentary tablets at the British Museum under catalogue designations in the K3000 range from the Ninevite library tradition contain passages that transition abruptly from the Dumuzid substitute narrative to what appears to be a divine council session in which Inanna's accumulated actions are reviewed, through a procedure employing terminology that matches the juridical language of divine council deliberations found in administrative texts from Nippur. Andrew George of the School of Oriental and African Studies, in his 2003 critical edition of the Gilgamesh epic, treats adjacent passages as narrative transitions, but the legal vocabulary they employ suggests they may represent fragments of a judgment procedure rather than simple narrative connective tissue. The K3000 range tablets from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh represent a collection category that differs institutionally from the Nippur scribal tradition in ways that may have allowed survival of texts that were suppressed in the mainstream Sumerian curriculum. Ashurbanipal's library, assembled in the 7th century BC through the systematic collection of tablets from temples and private libraries throughout Mesopotamia, was not a scribal school curriculum archive, but a royal research collection whose acquisition criteria prioritized comprehensiveness over curricular standardization. Tablets acquired for Ashurbanipal's collection included texts from peripheral scribal traditions, temple libraries that had maintained older text versions independently of the Nippur curriculum, and private scholarly collections that preserved compositions outside the mainstream educational program. Several tablets in the K3000 range show textual characteristics that distinguish them from standard Old Babylonian period copies of the compositions they appear to preserve, including unusual vocabulary choices, structural arrangements that differ from the canonical versions, and content that extends beyond the known boundaries of the compositions they partially match. These characteristics are consistent with what would be expected if these tablets derive from alternative textual traditions that preserved versions of narratives related to the mainstream compositions, but not subject to the same curricular standardization and selective management that shaped the mainstream tradition. The specific passages in the K3000 range tablets that appear to encode fragments of a divine council session addressing Inanna's accumulated violations employ three categories of legal vocabulary whose convergence in adjacent passages is statistically unlikely to be coincidental. The first is the vocabulary of formal complaint presentation, the specific Sumerian terms for bringing a case before the assembly that appear in the composition known as the debate between summer and winter. The second is the vocabulary of evidentiary enumeration, the grammatical construction used when a legal proceeding lists specific prior acts as the basis for a determination, which appears in the Nippur court records in a distinctive form that differs from narrative enumeration in its use of the completed action aspect rather than the sequential narrative aspect. The third is the vocabulary of binding determination, the specific construction used to express a divine council verdict in the lament for the destruction of Sumer and The presence of all three vocabulary categories in adjacent passages of the K3000 range tablets in a sequence that follows the procedural order in which they appear in known divine council narratives constitutes what Christopher Woods of the Oriental Institute described in his 2008 study of Sumerian literary language as a procedural signature, a combination of specialized vocabulary elements whose co-occurrence in the documented sequence is effectively diagnostic of a specific institutional context. The evidence accumulated across the 9 documented violations and their conspicuous absent consequences points toward a conclusion about the structure of Sumerian divine governance that challenges the most fundamental assumptions of modern scholarship about how ancient Mesopotamian religious thought conceptualized the limits of divine authority. The conventional interpretation of the Sumerian pantheon presents a hierarchical legal model in which higher authority constrains lower authority and in which violations of cosmic law generate recorded consequences for their perpetrators regardless of divine status. This interpretation is supported by numerous texts documenting divine judgment against gods who exceeded their authority. But Inanna's case demonstrates that this hierarchical, legal model contained a significant structural exception built into it, an exception that was not merely practiced but recognized, documented at the narrative level, and then preserved in its negative form as a conspicuous absence rather than as a positive legal record. That exception corresponded precisely to the deity who controlled the transitions between the cosmic realms themselves, between life and death, between love and war, between heaven and earth, the thresholds through which any enforcement mechanism of the divine council would necessarily have to pass. The evidence suggests that control over cosmic thresholds constituted a category of divine power that placed its holder effectively beyond the jurisdiction of the council, not through superior status in the hierarchy, but through the structural impossibility of administering justice against the figure who controlled the gates, the threshold control mechanism that placed Inanna beyond effective divine jurisdiction, operated through a structural logic that the Sumerian cosmological framework itself generated rather than through any explicit grant of immunity or privilege. The Divine Council's enforcement authority, as documented across multiple compositions and administrative records, depended upon the institutional coherence of the cosmic structure within which that authority operated. Punishments were administered through the same cosmic systems whose violation the punishments were designed to address. Banishment to the underworld required that the underworld function as a place of permanent containment. Binding required that bound entities remain bound within the structural conditions of the cosmic order. Stripping of divine attributes required that stripped attributes remained stripped under the authority of the stripping institution. Each enforcement mechanism depended upon the stability and integrity of the structural systems through which it operated, and Inanna's demonstrated willingness and capability to violate those structural systems meant that any punishment administered through them was potentially subject to the same kind of exploitation that had already allowed her to escape the Anunna's properly administered judgment. A being who had already penetrated the underworld, circumvented its gates, escaped its judicial determination, and returned to the upper world possessed a demonstrated capability to violate every enforcement mechanism available to the Divine Council, because every enforcement mechanism available to the Council operated through structural systems whose integrity Inanna had already proven she could compromise. The paradigm implication of this analysis extends beyond the specific question of Inanna's unpunished violations to the broader question of what the Sumerian divine governance system actually was and how it actually functioned. Because the conventional model of a hierarchical divine council with comprehensive jurisdiction over cosmic violations is demonstrably incomplete when measured against the full body of preserved evidence. The Sumerian texts preserve not a system of comprehensive divine justice, but a system of conditional divine justice, whose conditions included a structural exception for beings who controlled the threshold mechanisms that the enforcement system itself required. This exception was not a flaw in the system, but a feature of it, a recognition embedded within the system's own architecture that certain categories of divine power created jurisdictional situations that the Council's standard enforcement mechanisms could not resolve. Inanna's 9 violations and their absent punishment records are therefore not anomalies within an otherwise consistent divine legal system. They are the most fully documented expression of a structural feature that the divine governance system contained by necessity, a feature that the Sargonic period's theological program exploited and amplified, but did not create, and whose recognition transforms the conventional understanding of how the Sumerians conceptualized the relationship between divine law and divine power. What the 9 laws Inanna broke and the punishment the Sumerians never recorded ultimately reveal is that the most ancient legal tradition in human history already understood a distinction that modern jurisprudence continues to struggle with: the distinction between authority that is recognized and authority that is effective. The divine council at Nippur possessed recognized authority over every violation Inanna committed. The texts that preserve those violations are simultaneously texts that preserve the institutional framework within which they constituted violations. But recognized authority and effective authority are not the same thing, and the Sumerian scribes who preserved this extraordinary body of evidence about a goddess who broke 9 foundational laws without facing recorded consequence were preserving, with characteristic precision, exactly the institutional reality they observed: a legal system whose architecture contained within it the conditions of its own limitation, and a divine figure who understood and exploited those conditions with a sophistication that the most powerful figures in the Sumerian cosmos proved unable or unwilling to successfully address. The investigation that began with a single archival absence has arrived at a conclusion that reframes not merely the study of Sumerian mythology, but the foundational assumptions underlying how scholars understand the relationship between law, power, and institutional memory in the ancient world. Across 9 documented violations, 4 categories of divine silence, 2 millennia of continuous scribal transmission, and 30,000 tablets that preserve everything except the one category of record that should exist, the evidence converges on a conclusion that is both historically specific and universally significant. The world's oldest legal tradition preserved, with meticulous institutional precision, the record of its own structural limitation. What makes this conclusion remarkable is not merely what it tells us about Inanna or about Sumerian divine governance, but what it reveals about the scribes who preserved the tradition across the centuries of its transmission. These were professional specialists who understood the institutional dimensions of what they were copying. They recognized the legal vocabulary embedded in the violation narratives. They maintained the procedural precision of the divine council descriptions. They copied the substitute requirement, the Anunna judgment, and the Gala's enforcement mandate with the same care they devoted to actual court records from Nippur's human judicial archive. And they preserved all of this material across generations of continuous copying without ever producing, or without ever being permitted to produce, the consequence record that their own institutional logic demanded. The preservation of the crime without the verdict is itself a form of evidence, and it is evidence that was sustained not accidentally but deliberately across an institutional program spanning the full historical range of Sumerian civilization and extending into the Babylonian and Assyrian periods that inherited and transmitted the tradition. The pattern of institutional silence surrounding Inanna's violations finds echoes in governance traditions across multiple ancient civilizations, each of which confronted in its own institutional vocabulary the same fundamental problem that the Sumerian tradition preserved in its most legally explicit form, that systems of law depend for their enforcement upon structural conditions that sufficiently powerful actors can compromise, and that the honest record of such compromises threatens the legitimacy of the institutional framework that the law is supposed to sustain. The Sumerian scribes chose to preserve the honest record rather than eliminate it, embedding within the foundational curriculum of their civilization a body of evidence whose implications their successors in scholarship are only now beginning to read with the precision those scribes intended. For contemporary humanity, which constructs its own institutional frameworks under the assumption that recognized authority and effective authority are equivalent categories, The 9 laws Inanna broke and the punishment the Sumerians never recorded offer a lesson whose age does not diminish its relevance. The oldest legal tradition in human history already knew that the most consequential violations of institutional order are committed not by actors who lack access to power, but by those who control the thresholds through which power itself must pass. That knowledge was preserved in clay for 5,000 years, waiting for readers willing to recognize it for what it is.